name is Kellyanne Boyce, and I proudly serve as president of the Chautauqua Women's Club. Welcome to our Contemporary Issues Forum, or CIF for short. Next Saturday, August 17th, will be our last lecture of the season. I cannot believe it's here already. We will welcome Robin Radin, an internationally recognized expert in Chinese history, who will focus on the Cultural Revolution and its impact on society. As the editor of Mao's Lost Generation, Robin brings a nuanced understanding of what we can learn from the historical and cultural significance of this turbulent period in China's past. Please join us for what promises to be a fascinating talk. The Chautauqua Women's Club is a vibrant organization with a rich history. For 135 years, we've empowered the community through education, leadership opportunities, and life-changing scholarships for students. This summer, we proudly gave $40,000 to Chautauqua Institution, bringing our total to over $1.8 million in scholarships for students in the schools of performing and visual arts. We are very proud of that. But what we do best is provide you with opportunities to meet new people, build lifelong friendships, and be part of a welcoming community. This is why the Women's Club is known as the heartbeat of Chautauqua. If you are a member, we thank you and encourage you to get involved. Volunteering is the easiest way to meet new friends. If you are not yet a member, please consider joining. We have a membership table over there with the ladies in the blue. You can also sign up on our website or stop by our beautiful house next to the Athenaeum Hotel. We are greatly grateful, we are incredibly grateful, I should say, to the 2024 program sponsors for their generous support and belief in our exceptional programming. Your support helps bring relevant, thought-provoking speakers and some of the best programming to the grounds of Chautauqua. Our 2024 program sponsors are Sherry Gillette Sigward, Lauren Rich Fine of Greece Financial, Terry Tucker and Stephen Still, McGee's Women's Research Institute, and in memory of our dear Rita Arjun Auerbach, lovingly gifted by Kathy Bonner, Mary Lou Goodman, and Josette Raleigh, for Rita's dedication to the Chautauqua community and her absolute love for the Women's Club. Today, Berwood Yost will talk for approximately 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes or so of Q&A. After his talk, please queue up to these microphones right here. We highly encourage you to ask questions. He's expecting a few, including the folks on the lawn. But to keep our Q&A moving, please keep your questions concise with no Chautauqua prelude. Today's lecture is being videotaped by Ed Tomasini, which includes the Q&A session. If you don't want to be videotaped, please refrain from asking a question. And when you do come up to ask a question, please go about 1 inch from the mic so the audio can be recorded properly. I hope you all had a chance to read Berwood's article in today's Chautauquan Daily. Thank you always to Deb Treffs for her outstanding coverage of the Women's Club speakers. Thank you, Deb. So, on to Berwood. Berwood Yost is a prominent figure in the field of public opinion research and political analysis. You may remember his longtime partner, Terry Madonna. Terry was a frequent Women's Club speaker right here in the Hall of Philosophy. In 1992, Terry and Berwood created what was then known as the Keystone Poll to track public opinion on politics, public affairs, and elections in Pennsylvania. In 2004, Terry, Berwood, the center, and the poll moved to Franklin and Marshall College. In 2008, the Keystone Poll was renamed and the Franklin and Marshall College Poll. Terry retired in 2020, and we are thrilled to keep up our connection and keep it alive. Berwood is now the director of the Center for Opinion Research and the Floyd Institute for Public Policy at Franklin and Marshall College, and director of the Franklin and Marshall College Poll. Berwood Scholarship has appeared in journals that include fields of criminology, human rights, political science, psychology, and public health. His recent work has attempted to identify the ideological and partisan patterns among the state's voters. Berwood publishes a newsletter for the general audience, and those newsletters can be available at fnmpoll.org. That's fnmpoll.org. Berwood is here with his partner and wife, Dr. Christine Abbott. Thank you for making the trek to Chautauqua. I always look for a tidbit when we're out with our speaker, and last night at dinner did not disappoint. In addition to Berwood being our expert in public opinion, he is also a magician. To help pay his way through college, he didn't just rely on his academic skills, he performed magic tricks. So you never know. Berwood, on behalf of the Chautauqua Women's Club and the entire Chautauqua community, we are honored to have you with us. Let's give a warm Chautauqua welcome to Berwood Yost. You might need your rocks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Let's see if we can get that thing to stay at the right spot. How's that sound? A little louder, a little closer? There we go. All right, let me begin by thanking you for coming to listen to my talk about Pennsylvania's pivotal role in our upcoming presidential election. I also want to thank Kellyanne Boyce and the Chautauqua's Women's Club for inviting me to speak and for being wonderful hosts and ferreting out all that information I wanted to keep hidden. So I'm humbled to be added to the list of distinguished speakers who have addressed this forum. You know, it was late spring when I agreed to speak at today's event, and I fully expected that we'd be in a bit of a campaign lull. I mean, at that time, preferences in the presidential race were stable, so I fully expected that a Saturday in early August that fell between the parties' conventions would be a nice, relaxing time of year to reflect on the race. Wasn't that a pleasant thought? Events over the last 3 weeks have completely disrupted the presidential race, as I'm sure you've seen for yourself, and more than likely changed the dynamics that have saved the Democratic Party from an electoral rout, because that's where they were headed to. Still, the essential features of the race that will predict winners and losers remain in place, although those features now look somewhat different than they did a month ago. What remains unchanged, though, is that this election will probably be decided by the choices that Pennsylvania voters make on November 5th. When we are finished today, if all goes as planned, you should better understand the short-term and long-term forces driving Pennsylvanians' choices. So this is what I hope to accomplish today. First, I want to discuss a little bit about Pennsylvania's history of party competition, including reasons that Pennsylvania is a critical battleground today. Second, I'm going to talk about how changes to the state's electorate over the past quarter century, since 2000, have affected party competition and the state's partisanship. Third, I'll describe the main electoral indicators we use to understand which campaign has an advantage. And I'm going to take a short aside to talk about our popular governor, Josh Shapiro, and an opportunity that may have been missed. And then finally, since I spend so much of my time designing, administering, and analyzing polls, and since many of my comments today are based on polling indicators, I think I'll try to offer some ways, some ideas about ways that you can use polling data safely and thoughtfully. But before I go too far, I'd like to ask you a few questions. I am a pollster, after all. And actually, I understand that this was something that was practiced here at Chautauqua for many years, and that is figuring out how many folks are from Pennsylvania. How many of you are from Pennsylvania? Good, good. How many of you have been carefully watching Pennsylvania races? Oh, okay. few more. And how many of you simply have an interest in political polling? Whoa, okay, quite a few of you. Well, for the rest of you, maybe you're in the wrong place. I have heard there's a pachanga class somewhere if you want to go do some salsa. Anyway, let's talk about Pennsylvania's history of party competition because it is fascinating. Pennsylvania, as you know, is figuring in most conversations about the 2024 race. It's usually mentioned in the same breath as Michigan and Wisconsin as the states most likely to determine the winner of this fall's election. The state is often thought of as the tipping point state, which means it is the state that is most likely to provide the electoral votes that will produce the winner. The number of visits that the campaigns have made to our state is clear evidence that both campaigns believe that winning Pennsylvania is essential to their success. I will say that the tipping point designation as a political scientist is a reminder to me of how much the electoral college system for electing presidents distorts our election and political processes because it relies on aggregated state votes and not the total votes cast by individual voters. In 2020, only 8 states, 8, were decided by fewer than 5 percentage points in the presidential election. And in fact, 36 states had electoral margins of greater than 10 points. The electoral college process itself creates a lot of wasted votes, places way too much emphasis on the few states that are competitive. If you're from Pennsylvania, you know how much political advertising has already started. And it contributes to polarized politics by distorting the partisan margins in Congress. But whatever my feelings about the Electoral College, it is worth asking how the conditions that make Pennsylvania the biggest prize among the 6 potential tipping point states came about given our history. Perhaps the most interesting bit about Pennsylvania politics was that it was long dominated by Republicans. From the Civil War until the 1950s, the state was dominated by the Republican organization, which was the most efficient political machine in the United States. That organization was led consecutively by 3 party bosses, Simon Cameron, Matthew Stanley Quay, and Boyce Penrose, from the Civil War until the 1920s. And in fact, last night at the concert, I saw a gentleman, I think from Washington County, PA. I think that was on the back of his hat, and it was an Elks hat. Well, Republican dominance was so pronounced that in 1930, the Democratic candidate for governor left the race to become the grand exalted ruler of the Elks. That is not a lie. So Democrats did not start making electoral gains in Pennsylvania until the New Deal. In fact, Pennsylvania was one of only 5 states that voted for Herbert Hoover over Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. Democrats did not take control of Pittsburgh until 1933, more broadly Allegheny County until 1936, and Philadelphia remained a Republican city until 1951. It was the last major city in the industrial Northeast to flip to Democrats. But Democrats did begin gaining an edge in voter registration by 1960, and the party has not relinquished that advantage since. But the truth is, old habits died hard in Pennsylvania. For many years, voters more often than not preferred Republican candidates for major office over Democrats. There was, in fact, evidence that although Democrats had a voter registration advantage in our state, there was a sizable chunk of Republicans or a sizable chunk of registered Democrats who really identified as Republicans and gave the party an operational advantage in state elections. From 1960 to 2000, despite Democrats having a clear advantage in party registration, Republicans won 2/3 of the state's top-tier races for president, Senate, and governor. Throughout this period, they also controlled the state Senate and, more often than not, the state House. But things began to change after 2000 in Pennsylvania. And in fact, Donald Trump's victory in Pennsylvania in 2016 is actually an exception to broader trends in the state. If we look at all the top-tier races for governor between 2000 and 2024, Democrats carried 5 of 6 gubernatorial races, 5 of 6 presidential races, and 4 of 8 Senate races, including the last 2. So since 2000, 70% of the top-tier races in Pennsylvania have gone to Democrats. Voting behavior has clearly changed in Pennsylvania since the turn of the century, and they seem to have moved towards Democrats. The question is, why? Well, there are 2 related trends that I'm going to share with you today that have had a meaningful effect on the state's politics. These trends have driven changes in the voting behavior I just described. First, there's been partisan sorting that has driven social and political polarization in the state. This sorting has in turn driven geographic realignment of the state's voter registration. I'd go so far as to say that you cannot understand Pennsylvania politics without understanding the geographic underpinnings of state politics. So let me tell you about those trends. One of the most notable features of state politics over the past 2 decades is that the political parties have become more homogeneous and less diverse because partisans have sorted themselves demographically and socially. The most consequential and important realignments to recognize have happened along the lines of ideological beliefs, religious beliefs, and educational attainment. The identity-based ideology measured in our polling shows that Republicans have become much more conservative in the state since 2000, with the proportion of Republicans who identify as conservative rising from just under half before 2000 to 70% today. The proportion of Democrats who identify as liberal has increased a little bit from about 1/3 to 40%, while the proportion who identify as conservative have declined from about 2 in 10 to 1 in 10. But even though Democrats are a bit more liberal and a bit less conservative than they were in 2000, roughly the same proportion, nearly half, still consider themselves moderate. So Democrats in Pennsylvania are clearly the more moderate and more centrist party, at least among our voters. In terms of religion, Republicans are also more aligned with Protestant denominations than they were before the turn of the century, while Democrats have become less aligned with any religious group. But what's most important to recognize is that the share of Republicans who do not identify with any religion has basically remained consistent, while the share of Democrats who identify as unaffiliated with any religion has doubled to represent a majority of the Democrats in Pennsylvania. To put it simply, Republicans in Pennsylvania are much more likely to be aligned with a religious group than are Democrats, which was not true prior to this century. And the final, perhaps most important change relates to education. In 2000, the parties in Pennsylvania had about equal shares of college graduates, with roughly 1/3 of each party having a college degree. The share of Republicans with a college degree has stayed about the same since 2000, but the share of Democrats with a college diploma rose from 1/3 to 1/2 over the last 2 decades. Democrats are now clearly the party of the college-educated, and Republicans are far more likely to represent working-class voters. Partisan sorting within these 3 variables, ideology, religious affiliation, and education, has created partisans, as you may have seen, who behave, think, and react to elections and partisan cues differently than they used to. For instance, in 2000, the parties had about equal shares of veterans and gun owners. In fact, it was easier to find a Democratic gun owner in Western PA than a Republican one around Philadelphia. But the social sorting I've described means that fewer Democrats identify as veterans today, while a majority of Republicans are now gun owners. The realignment of broad policy-related preferences for issues like gun control and abortion access have followed this sorting of demographic and social identities and are examples of how attitudes within the parties have become much more homogenous. The share of Republicans, for instance, who favor gun control laws has shrunk this century, falling from half, believe it or not, to about 1/4 today. During the same time span, the share of Democrats who favored more gun control has risen substantially from about 2 in 3 to 4 in 5, more than 80%. On the issue of abortion access and rights, half as many Republicans today support abortion rights with no limitations as did so in 2000, while nearly twice as many Democrats believe abortion should be available under any circumstances, rising from 1/4 to over 1/2. And those numbers actually are from before the Dobbs decision. The upshot of all of this is that, broadly speaking, the middle ground, the middle policy ground, has eroded for most partisans in my state. This partisan sorting has, in fact, shuffled the state's political map. The sorting has driven a massive realignment of regional voter registration that has taken place this century. So between 2000 and 2022, northeastern Pennsylvania, think Luzerne and Lackawanna County in the northeastern part of the state, has become much more competitive. While Democrats still have a slight registration edge, their advantage there is much smaller than it once was. Democrats have essentially lost western Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh. Counties like Fayette County, Washington County, Greene County. The northwest part of the state had nearly equal partisan registration in 2000s, but now Republicans have a 17-point advantage in that place. Democratic registration in the southwest has also shrunk from about a 29-point Democratic advantage to a 9-point Democratic deficit. On the other hand, and in fact on the other side of the state, the Republicans have lost ground in southeastern Pennsylvania. Republican registration in the suburbs around Philadelphia have gone from a 22-point Republican advantage to a 9-point deficit there as well. Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh's located, Philadelphia, they've still retained large advantages in Democratic registration. Central Pennsylvania, where I'm from, still provides a lot of votes and a lot of registration advantage for Republicans. But there have been major shifts elsewhere throughout the state. And by the way, despite Democrats having a registration advantage, there are a sufficient number of third-party voters in the Northeast and in the Southeast to make those areas pretty competitive. So while we can acknowledge there's a lot of things that have driven polarization, including things like economic growth, population growth, all of those have some effect. But the demographic and social sorting that I've talked about here is probably one of the main propellants of those kinds of changes. So clearly, ideological and regional sorting have altered our politics. Compared to 2000, Republicans now seem to have an easier time motivating and appealing to their voters, given that the party has more ideological cohesion. Democrats have a much more difficult task motivating and messaging their voters, since they need to appeal to both the moderates that constitute their essential core and the liberals who provide the energy for their base. These Democratic factions are really what are keeping Pennsylvania competitive. They're what make Pennsylvania the tipping point state. In fact, the state's battleground status exists mostly because of those moderate voters I've described. They are the state's single largest ideological group. One of the overlooked but most consequential changes in our state voters' political affiliation has taken place among these moderate voters. In 2000, about 40% of the state's moderates were registered as Republicans, but only 1 in 5 are registered as Republican today. So the real battleground in Pennsylvania is among the state's moderate voters, 3/4 of whom are registered Democrats or independents, which includes a portion of people who used to be Republicans. These realigned moderate voters have likely moved the state from leaning Republican in the 20th century to leaning Democrat today. No one can say for sure whether this change is going to continue, but it supplies the essential context for understanding, I think, most elections in Pennsylvania these days. So that's the background. That was a lot of background, I know, but I think it's important to understand how much the state has changed. Where does the race stand today? That's mostly why you're here, I'm sure. So when I'm trying to evaluate the relative electoral position of the major party candidates in a state election, I never rely on one thing, particularly not the head-to-head matchup between the candidates that we so often see. The indicators I use include measures about the candidates, about the electorate's general mood, their interest in the election, and their feelings about each candidate. So to assess the general mood, we ask questions about the direction of the state and the country. Sometimes you may have heard these called the right track, wrong track questions. We ask ratings of each voter's personal financial situation, both today and in the future. We also assess the issues that motivate them, often by asking about the most important problem facing the state, the country, and their families. And finally, we often ask about which party's candidate that person prefers for the representative in Congress. That is known as the generic ballot question. While these questions are often answered through a partisan lens, there are enough moderate and independent voters, as I just told you, that it allows us to understand if a specific issue or circumstance is going to be more helpful to one party or another because it appeals to those moderates and independents. So, where are we today? Well, most of the indicators of general mood seem to offer bad news for Democrats in Pennsylvania. Our polls show that the state's registered voters have a generally negative outlook about the economy and the direction of the state through 2023 and into 2024. In October 23, for example, half of respondents said they were worse off financially than the year before, largely because of inflation and the rising cost of living, and that number hasn't changed. It's basically the same today. If there is some good news for Democrats, it is that only 1 in 5 voters expects to be worse off financially a year ago. Now, that might not sound good, but it's a big improvement from last fall when more than a third of voters said they expected they were going to be worse off next year. Given this, it's probably no surprise that concern about the economy, including unemployment and higher gas and utility prices, were consistently mentioned throughout 2023 as the most important and often mentioned problems facing the state. And concerns about the economy remain the most important issue to voters today. Former President Trump has a clear advantage over President Biden throughout the campaign, or had an advantage throughout the campaign on handling the economy. And it looks like he is still going to have that advantage over Kamala Harris. If the Democrats do have an issue advantage, it is that abortion rights looms as a less mentioned top-of-mind problem, but it is still an important issue to many of the state's voters. Some analysis of the 2022 midterms and the 2023 state Supreme Court races hinted at the importance of abortion rights as a motivator for some voters and as a true liability for Republicans. The last 2 election cycles suggested that at least some voters are thinking about more than just the economy, the candidates on the ballot, and the president's performance as they make their choices. The Republican Party's views on abortion have created a real problem for them because of a portion of voters who identify with the Republican Party itself see its abortion position as outside of the mainstream. Then again, Democrats have issue vulnerabilities on things like immigration and public safety because more independents and more moderates see their positions as outside the mainstream. So we should keep an eye out to see if perspectives about the economy change and if voters' assessments of their economic circumstances change in the coming months. We'll also need to see if abortion rights continues to motivate voters to Democrats' advantage, or whether some other issue emerges that advantages Republicans. Now, to assess the candidates, we normally ask how favorably a voter feels toward each candidate. And when there's an incumbent, we tend to see how much people approve or disapprove of their performance. In any race that has a candidate looking to stay in office, their job approval ratings are probably the most important signal to understand. People forget, for instance, how dissatisfied voters had become with Barack Obama's performance in 2016, which contributed significantly to Hillary Clinton's loss. In this presidential race, evaluations about President Biden's job performance are going to influence judgments about Kamala Harris's candidacy, as Obama's did Clinton's. At the moment, people are not happy with Biden's performance, and that could be a real drag on Harris's candidacy. Let me just give you some numbers. President Biden's job approval ratings in the state averaged 29% in our polls in 2023, with a low of 27%. Now, his numbers are a little better now, but they still remain in the low to mid-30s. The erosion in the president's job approval ratings was the main reason that he could not reassemble his electoral coalition from 2020. His job approval ratings showed notable declines taking place among young voters, among minority voters, and among progressives. His job approval ratings, in fact, declined 20 points since he first took office among Democrats, liberals, non-whites, residents of southeastern Pennsylvania, and those living in the large counties where state elections are typically decided. His debate performance further hurt him to the point where he was trailing Donald Trump in Pennsylvania by several points when he left the race. Remember that in 2020, Biden never, not once, trailed Trump at any point in Pennsylvania. And he was leading Trump by about 5 points at the same point in 2020. Now, I will say it's not just about the incumbent. Hope for Democrats and the Harris-Walz ticket lies with those persuadable voters who might be unhappy with the president's performance, but are not sure that the alternative is acceptable. This is where Harris probably has an advantage. Former President Trump's overwhelming support from Republican voters during the primary process has hidden an important feature of the presidential race. Despite his strong support from Republican primary voters, President Trump's standing among all of the state's voters has changed very little since he lost in 2020. Prior to the 2020 election, Mr. Trump's favorability ratings were overwhelmingly negative. 57% of the state's voters viewed him unfavorably. He remains unpopular today. 55% still view him unfavorably. Mr. Trump's image has not improved among the state's voters despite the support he has built among his base. Vice President Harris looks to be viewed slightly more favorably than he does at the moment. Still a long way to go. So let's just think about a few comparative indicators from August of 2020 to today. Neither Democrat in 2020 or 2024 was viewed more negatively than positively, and former President Trump was viewed negatively in both instances. Presidential approval for President Trump in 2020 was minus 18, so lots more people thought he was doing a bad than a good job. It's minus 30 for Biden, so he doesn't have an advantage there. And by the way, voters seem as excited today about the election as they were in 2020, which is a change since Harris got on the ticket. And that's good news for Democrats as well. But perhaps the biggest difference between now and then are ratings of economic well-being. So in 2020, a few more people said they were better off than worse off last year financially. So about 6 points more people said, I'm better off today than I was last year financially. In 2024, views of people's personal economic situations are dismal. 33% more people said they're worse off than better off a year ago. On balance, this suggests that the underlying conditions don't give a large advantage to either candidate at the moment, although the Harris candidacy is still new to most voters. It seems that we are in for a real close contest once again, if nothing changes, at least in Pennsylvania. But despite these numbers that really are tough for an incumbent's party, Kamala Harris appears to have a slight edge in a multi-candidate race against Trump, largely because he is viewed so negatively by so many people. We have a poll in the field right now, we'll release next week. And the data we're seeing right now suggests that she's going to have a small lead in Pennsylvania. And in fact, if you saw the New York Times this morning, they show her leading by 4 points in Pennsylvania, which is about what we will show. What's clear from our data is that her lead is due in part to third-party candidates having less support than they did before Biden's withdrawal, which means that some of the voters I mentioned earlier that supported Biden in 2020 but have gone away from Democrats have started to come back to them. It also helps, frankly, that for the past 3 weeks, Mr. Trump has been unable to reset his campaign and accept the newfound momentum and vibe shift that Democrats currently enjoy. She has certainly had what might feel like a convention bump. We'll see if that persists. Now, let me have a minute to talk about Governor Josh Shapiro. I mean, it's really hard in a race that's going to be this close to understand what's going to finally tip the balance to one candidate or the other. Potentially, any small thing could help make the difference, which is why there's going to be a lot of second guessing of Harris's choice of Tim Walz as vice president when she really could have done something to help her in Pennsylvania, which was choosing Josh Shapiro as her running mate. I've got a lot of notes here about the things Shapiro has done, and I think they're all interesting, but I think the thing I want to talk about most, because everybody talks about his current job approval rating and how good he is on the stump and how strongly he won his first election in 2022, but what most people overlook when they're thinking about those things is that he has demonstrated his political skills and talents before when he was running for Attorney General in Pennsylvania in 2020. That is a campaign where he shared the ballot with Joe Biden. And in that 2020 race, Josh Shapiro won more votes than Joe Biden in Pennsylvania, even though fewer people voted for Attorney General. In fact, Shapiro was the only Democratic state row office candidate to win the 2020 election. In fact, Biden and Shapiro were the only vote getters among Democrats that had a majority. Republicans won the congressional vote, the state House vote, the state Senate vote, and 2 or 3 row offices. It was a great Republican year, except for what Shapiro was able to do. So in that 2020 race, Biden won 13 of the state's counties. Shapiro won 14, but he carried Luzerne County in the northeastern part of the state by a really thin margin. But that was still about 14 points better than Biden did in Luzerne County. You may recall that Luzerne County was the center of the political universe for explaining Trump's success after the 2016 election. And it provides the exemplar for many people of white working class county that has soured on Democrats. Now, there's a lot of reason Shapiro appeals to the state's voters, and I'm not going to go into them, but it really seems very likely that had he been selected, he would have helped. I mean, the evidence we have, it's not clear that vice presidential choices make much of a difference. But the last time we had a vice president from Pennsylvania was 1845. So it has been a long time since we've had a chance to vote on a vice presidential candidate. We do know from the state's primary elections how much Pennsylvania voters like to support candidates that come from where they live. And if you've ever met a Pennsylvanian, you probably know how important a sense of place is to our residents. I really, really wanted to see if our preference for localism, some people might call it parochialism, but if that preference for local folks carried over to a presidential race. Tim Walz is an interesting and I think successful choice so far, but mark this, if Harris does not win Pennsylvania, her vice presidential choice is going to be second-guessed forever. I haven't talked about Bob Casey. Where's Bob? Maybe some of you, what about Bob? Maybe some of you are asking, the United States Senate candidate. He's killing it right now. We can talk about that in the Q&A, but his lead is probably double digits. He's really running a good campaign. All right, so this brings me to the final topic I want to discuss, which is polling. Everything I talked about today was pretty much about polling. I think polling is the best tool we have for understanding political campaigns, bar none. So that's why I want to talk a little bit about strengths and weaknesses, strengths and limitations, and how you might make the best use of polling data. It seems like every election, somebody writes a story that basically asks us to consider whether political polling has outlived its usefulness. This question was raised in 2016 and 2020 when people thought the polls were off the mark. I think the real question isn't with the polls themselves, but that pollsters, and particularly those who report about polls, do a really poor job of setting expectations about what polls can and cannot do. If there is anything to take away from polling in recent elections, it's that everyone should be more careful about making predictions based on a single indicator of who is in the lead, particularly when there's so much other data to look at, data I've described today. This means not only polling data, but all kinds of other indicators that can help us understand a race. In 2020, we talked about unemployment rates. In addition to polling indicators, we talked about COVID deaths, we talked about campaign spending, we talked about early voting. All of those things can signal what's going to happen in a campaign. We don't have to rely solely on the polls. But pollsters need to help too. They got to do a better job of reporting on the uncertainty of their estimates and discussing the many sources of error beyond just sampling error, including the tendency for polls to share similar biases in any given election. So when we can't figure out who's going to vote in a particular election because one group is more or less excited than another, that's true for all pollsters. And if that doesn't, if the bias makes itself go away, all the polls will be affected by something like that. I would say the biggest mistake we make is that we believe polls offer precise predictions when really they're just blunt instruments. If you consider that the average margin of error among the state-level presidential polls was about 3.9 points in 2020, it means that any difference between the two candidates of less than 8 points is not statistically distinguishable from zero. It means it basically could be a tie. Most pre-election polls in most contested states will be too imprecise to predict the outcome of a close race. And by the way, I do think it's silly to assess a poll's quality by comparing the outcome of a race to a single number. I mean, how many of you would make a major life event change based on one thing? We're usually looking for multiple indicators to help us. I think we are wiser when we use polling as a map to the political geography than when we use it to predict an outcome. Many pollsters are just trying to understand what's influencing voters and shaping the race, and they're not really trying to pick a winner. So I hope you keep that sort of thing in mind. So I want to stop here. I still have lots of stuff I could say, but those are the major points I wanted to talk about today. I wanted you to understand that Pennsylvania has a long history of being a one-party state, that it's kind of new to us to be competitive. We're competitive in a different way today than we were from 1960 to 2000. And that's been driven by polarization and the way that the parties have sorted themselves. And that has also lent itself to differences in the regions of Pennsylvania and which candidates they're willing to support. All that stuff is really interesting and crucial to understand. But by understanding that, it might give you a clue about how things might play out here in 2024. So why don't we do some question and answer so I can get to your questions. You've been chomping at the bit. I've seen you. Go ahead.
Well, I wonder if you could talk about access to voting for those that want to vote. I think I've heard of some efforts by the Republican legislature that's going to make it more difficult to vote.
Well, Pennsylvania actually, because it's a split legislature and the governor is a Democrat, our voting access rules are pretty good. They haven't changed a whole lot since 2020. Now, that's happened in some other states to make it much more difficult to vote. But in Pennsylvania, we're still seeing a lot of access for mail-in voting, no excuse absentee voting, which was true in 2020, which some states have tried to scale back, but Pennsylvania still allows that to happen. So I'd say from a voting access standpoint, Pennsylvania looks pretty much the way it did in 2020. Yes.
Yeah, I want to ask about the elephant in the room. You speak about Josh Shapiro as being the possible better choice in order to get Pennsylvania. However, the fact that he's Jewish, the fact that there's so much anti-Semitism, the fact that Kamala is trying to walk such a narrow road in terms of Israel and what's happening, how would that have helped her? How?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and I have to be, I'm representing Pennsylvania here in the interest of Pennsylvania, but frankly, Pennsylvania voters have already shown that they feel strongly about Josh Shapiro. His job approval ratings make him the most popular Democrat in the state by far. In fact, his job approval ratings are the highest among any first-term governor since 1994, when Tom Ridge was governor. That was a different political era. So I think that, at least in Pennsylvania, this may not be true in other places, but in Pennsylvania, by the way, the one place Democrats probably need to win to be in the White House, Josh Shapiro would help. I have no doubt about that. He is a dynamic candidate whose who's very popular and has done a lot of things that state voters seem to like. I mean, as a political scientist, I was dying to see if there was a benefit. I'm glad I wouldn't have to make that decision, but I have no doubt in my mind. The last two elections there was a difference of 44,000 votes in 2016 and 80,000 votes in 2020. Josh Shapiro could provide those number of votes, I think.
Yes. Just before Biden withdrew, the Siena College poll of New York had the race only 8 points difference, which is very, very close for New York. And it had the Jewish vote almost evenly divided and the Hispanic vote almost evenly divided. So I'm just wondering, I know a lot of Jewish people are really incensed at the anti-Semitism that's going on, but I think many of them are going to return to the Democratic Party. But I find a lot of people are really angry at the crime issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm concerned is that when, in the summer, there's going to be a serious crime in New York by somebody that the district attorney there let go easily, and Trump is going to make a big issue that they prosecuted me and are letting all these criminals go. So that's basically
look, I think it's clear. When Biden withdrew from the race reset itself, and actually, maybe the simplest way to think about it is it went back to kind of a generic Democrat. This is where things would have been had it been any Democrat running against any Republican. That's sort of the stasis that we've gone back to. The Republicans are still trying to reset because they had a big advantage. And so I think possibly they're going to be looking for some kind of issue, whether it's related to immigration or crime. You actually probably don't get to see the number of commercials that we get to see in our state. I think, I may have mentioned this, I think Joe Biden spent $15 million in June in running ads in Pennsylvania. So we've seen the ads about illegal immigration, about crime being rampant, about immigrants taking money that should go. I mean, we've seen all of those ads. I think Republicans will continue to look for something that resonates with voters, and we'll see if anything sticks. Which side am I on? This side.
Do you have any data about whether voters would change their votes if the candidates announced their proposed cabinet appointees? In specific, if Governor Josh Shapiro was announced before Election Day as the intended Secretary of X or anything else. Same for Donald Trump's campaign.
Sure. No, it's a fair question. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I didn't get into some of the research that the political scientists have done about the vice presidential choice, but the general idea is it doesn't make much of a difference. I think maybe this year it would have, but we'll never know. Not that I'm bitter about that. But I think, you know, if people are not voting about the VP, as seems to be the case, I don't think they'll care about the cabinet secretary. Most people don't know much about government anyway, so they you know, what does that person do? But you never know what might stick. I mean, but I don't think you couldn't get the same bounce from, say, Shapiro as Attorney General as you would get from Shapiro as VP. That's my guess. Yes.
Thanks. I continue to be discouraged by the fact that the candidates are forced to just focus on the swing states versus the whole country, and I'm sure you share that.
I do.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where the people can select the president versus the Electoral College? I know that a constitutional amendment would be really tough, but there's been an initiative, and I'm not sure where it stands, to get states, a number of states that total 270 electoral votes to commit to use their
the electoral vote
submit their
compact,
electoral votes based on who wins the popular election. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's a great idea. I mean, if you're in Pennsylvania, you're inundated with advertising. I would bet between the campaigns and the affiliated PACs, they might spend $400 or $500 million in Pennsylvania this year. I mean, that's a lot of money. And that's a lot of things when I'm watching the Phillies or Penn State play football, I got to watch those ads too, right? So it'd be nice to spread that money out and make sure everybody has a vote. Because seriously, I mean, if you're in California, you know, your vote really doesn't, if you vote for a Democrat, it really doesn't count in the same way as a vote somewhere else counts. It's just, I mean, that's just the way the Electoral College works. It has a lot of distorting effects in policy and representation. I'd love to see it go. I think most political scientists would. I don't know how you get to a constitutional amendment to do it.
But how about the initiative?
The compact? Yeah, it's non-binding, so I don't know, right? Yes.
I wonder if you'd be interested to comment on my own poll of Pennsylvania, which shows that Trump enthusiasm has waned considerably. And that's what I do is I drive 250 miles from Warren to near Gettysburg. It's all back roads. It's all total
I
Trump
probably
country.
drove that same route to get here.
So I do that route all the time because my daughter lives in Maryland. Anyway, so I've been counting the Trump signs for 4 years. And along this same route. It's all back roads. There are no towns. Warren would be by far the biggest city I visit. 4 years ago, I counted 25. That stayed consistent. It went down to 12. And the most recent trip, which was just a week ago after Harris, I thought this is going to be big now because they're really going down, 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 down. I counted though I saw, there's some classy ones like Joe and the Ho must go and things like that. But I only counted 15. So to me, that's way down from what it was. And the signs and even some of the signs I've counted have been up for 4 years, and they look pretty bad. Yeah. Though sometimes they went out and they'd paint out the pence.
Yeah, that's right.
So
I've seen that. Yeah.
There's a big black spot on the bottom of the sign. So anyway, therefore, and I know the state pretty well, I think that's my evidence that it's going to go like it did 4 years ago.
I like your polling, and I believe in other forms of evidence, right? For sure. And in 2016, the yard sign thing was real. I mean, I must have been quoted a million times saying yard signs don't make a difference, but yeah, it did indicate enthusiasm, right? And so I think maybe you're right that enthusiasm for the Trump candidacy is probably not beyond what it was, and I think our data would support that, right? The way people feel about him, I mean, let's face it, you either like him or you don't. There's not much of a middle ground. I think you're right about the enthusiasm. I think that
no added. I mean, I understand. I
Sure.
know a lot of MAGA people.
Sure, but
I grew up in Ohio, so, but I just don't see them getting anywhere.
yeah. I think this still is a toss-up race at the point because there's a lot of people who are really disaffected by their economic circumstances, and they may not be wild about Trump, but they don't like what Biden did, and they think things were better 4 years ago. So that's what's going to ultimately twist us at the end. Yes.
I wanted to ask about debates.
Yes.
This isn't particularly Pennsylvania-centered, but obviously the Trump-Biden debate turned into a significant political disaster. And I wonder if polling generally shows, I think back to Kennedy and Nixon, for instance. What do you think about Harris and Trump debating and its effect on the polls?
Yeah. So debates typically don't, have much effect on public perception of the race. There might be a small bounce, and then things go back to normal. That's traditionally what's happened. But obviously, this debate, the end of June, was different because we saw all of the trend lines bend away from President Biden after that debate. So the debate this year was one of the most consequential debates we've ever seen in terms of outcomes and effects. I think a Harris-Trump debate will be, given the increased enthusiasm, I think there'll be a lot of people who will watch it. And I suspect for people still trying to get a sense of who Kamala Harris is, that it's going to be important for her. Whether it has a lasting effect, we'll have to see. Certainly won't have the effect that we saw in June. That was a one-time event, I suspect. So.
I wondered whether your polling took into consideration how candidates campaign. One of the things that's interesting about both Fetterman and Shapiro, and I live in Franklin County, is they campaigned in all the counties and didn't ignore us like many candidates have.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. We have from time to time asked people in our polls whether they've had contact with the candidates in some way. And I think there's a history in Pennsylvania of actually the best statewide candidates going into every county. That was something that Arlen Specter, our former U.S. Senator, really held up as an example of how much he cared about the state. And in fact, I think there's some videos, if you go online, you can see Bob Casey recite off the top of his head all 67 counties and the places he's visited there. So while we don't always ask about it in polls, making contact with voters and getting out into different parts of the state sends a signal that you care. And as I said, I think that's something that's important to Pennsylvania voters. And so I don't have any doubts that that makes a difference.
Hi, you touched on this a bit earlier, but being from Illinois, I know that my vote is not likely to change the result of the presidential election.
Right.
But Pennsylvania people have this very wonderful, hallowed position of being able to maybe affect the results of the election. So I wonder if you have any polling or any thoughts on, are Pennsylvanians therefore much more likely to go to the polls? Is there a higher propensity? How much higher is it?
Yeah.
And then secondly, does the advertising that's spent there actually have the effect of either, one, getting them to the polls, or two, changing their vote?
It's a great question, and the answer is yes. In the last 2 elections, voting age population in Pennsylvania turned out at about 4.5% higher rate than the rest of the country. So, I mean, the advertising probably drives that. It's hard to know what makes the difference, but I would think the advertising and all the campaigning gets voters to pay attention. We see the interest go up, and we definitely see turnout is higher here than it is in other places. And that's probably because of all the attention we get. Good question, thanks.
My question has to do with methodology of polling.
Yes, great.
And I didn't hear you talk about.
Turn that up a little bit.
Okay. My question has to do with, you didn't mention unregistered voters, which there's been a lot of growth. I live in Lehigh County, Northampton County, and
I wish I had time, because I was going to give you I have a typology of Pennsylvania counties. Maybe afterwards we could talk about it, because your counties figure into that.
And I often wondered, landlines are going away. The media form that you use to reach out to people, to ask them their questions of who they're voting in, how have you adjusted for that?
Yeah.
How do you deal with
So
reaching out to
it's a
who
great
you're gonna vote
question. Polling today is completely different than it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago. The way that most of our polling is done nowadays involves getting a list of registered voters, which you can get from the state. The state makes that available. And then adding all kinds of information to that list: phone numbers, email addresses, cell phone numbers, all those kinds of things. And then sampling from that. Once we sample from our lists, we mail everybody in our sample a postcard and tell them, hey, we're doing this poll, we're interested in your attitudes, would you participate? And that allows people to call us if they want to participate, or they can go online and complete a survey if they would like to do that, or they can just wait and we'll call them, or we'll text them, or we'll email them, or we'll do all of those things. So our methodological approach is to make it as easy as possible for people to respond and to do it in any way they like so that we hear what they have to say. Now, our methodology isn't the same as everybody else's, and that's an important, we didn't have time to talk about that, but I mean, a poll is not a poll is not a poll, like one car brand is not, is the same as another, right? There are variables that tell you about quality in different products, and that's true with polling as it is with anything else. But we make a real effort to reach out to people and to give them an opportunity to respond as easily as they can. Yes.
Hi, I'm from the 14th Ward in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
We're the biggest ward in the state, and we have about 78% of all voters are registered as Democrats. Shapiro got 92% of the vote. But Summer Lee, who's a member of the squad, also won
Yes.
overwhelmingly. She
Yes.
won by, I don't know, close to 20 points. So my question is to you, it sounds like you're asking questions about overall, what does the economy look like? It sounds like maybe you're asking some questions about their attitudes about abortion. But do you ask any other questions? Some of the things that I think are really in where I live, the war, the Israeli-Hamas war, is a critical dividing point for people. And it doesn't break down just by religious affiliation. And public education is another really critical not trying to privatize education. So do you ask those questions? Because I didn't hear that.
Yeah, no,
and I
look-
feel like they're really critical in sort of splitting the hairs between all these people and what they're going to do.
It's a good question, and I mean, we ask about all kinds of things in our polls. We do ask about everything from fracking to education to feelings about international conflict. I mean, it depends on the poll, though. We can't. So get back to the methodology question, I can't ask people to spend 30 minutes on the phone with me as much as I wish they would. So we normally have to pick and choose what we ask in any given poll. So the sorts of things I talked about are things we ask consistently from poll to poll. But every poll is supplemented with information that's going to help us understand policy issues or topics that are important. So it just depends on the poll. But we do ask those questions, and I think those often yield more interesting results from the horse race. The truth is, if I did a poll and didn't ask who's ahead, nobody would cover it. So I ask who's ahead, faced head to head, and then that lets me do all the other interesting stuff. And there's lots of interesting stuff to study in PA, and we do.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks, and I know that your special area is Pennsylvania, but my question is about the rest of the country and the non-8 states that are going to determine the results of the election. Is there a benefit to the campaigners, to the candidates, to going to all the states? And would you imagine that some people might swing the other way based on who the candidates are now?
So since the outcomes seem so predetermined, right, in many of those states, I mentioned 36 states had a large advantage for one candidate or the other, you have to remember that every campaign is limited in terms of its resources. And the resources are money, which there seems to be a lot of, but also candidate time. And the candidate's time is probably the most valuable resource. And there's just so many places they can go and be effective during a campaign. So while I think if you talk to most campaigns, they'd say we would love to spend more time in more places, the truth is they can't do it because they don't have the time to do it. It might make a difference, but they just don't have the time to do it. And in fact, if you look back, I think back to 2016, Hillary Clinton visited Pennsylvania all the time, but she was criticized for not visiting it more, right? So, you really do, as a campaign, have to focus on these swing states, because if you don't win them, you don't serve. So.
Yes. When the poll numbers change, how much of that is because people are more enthusiastic about voting or not voting, and how much is because people change their mind from one candidate to the other? Do you have a feel for that balance?
Yeah, it's both. It's both.
50-50 or 75-25 or do you know?
I don't know at this point. Maybe this week when I analyze my poll, I'll look at that. But there's no doubt that that the people who've become more excited were thinking about either sitting out the race or voting for a third-party candidate. So, like, at one point, 20% of the voters in our polls were choosing a third-party candidate or said, I don't know who I'm voting for, I may not vote. That number has already shrunk. That's below half. And the number of people who are voting for third-party candidates has declined. So I think Robert Kennedy Jr., for instance, in Pennsylvania was polling close to 10%. He's probably at half that now. And many of those people came back to Democrats. So it's a combination of both more enthusiasm and preference for different candidates, but I'm not sure what the balance is. Yeah.
What's the status of the Senate race, and will either of the candidates in the Senate race have some kind of coattails to pull in a presidential number? improve it or hurt it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Senate race is interesting. And actually, one of the things that most concerned Democrats was that all of their Senate candidates in contested states were running well ahead of Joe Biden. And in fact, even in Pennsylvania right now, Bob Casey has a much bigger advantage over his challenger, his Republican challenger, Dave McCormick. He's probably beating him by at least 10 points in the state. McCormick has a tough task ahead of him because he's not truly someone that Trump has anointed as part of his movement, and he's got all this history as a manager of a private equity firm that has done business around the world, and typically supporters of the Republican Party right now aren't wild about that kind of international big business, kind of thing. So the Senate race looks like it's going to be something that Casey wins, probably pretty easily. In fact, he's been up. He won his first election in 2006. I think this is his third time up for re-election. No one's come within 10 points of him previously. And I think that's probably going to be true this time. Now, whether he encourages some people to vote for Harris, whether he has coattails, maybe reverse coattails, maybe. And in part, maybe it depends on how much both he and Josh Shapiro campaign and support that ticket. I expect them both to be out talking about that race. And so maybe they can bring some of their voters along. Senator Casey's style is certainly different than Kamala Harris's style. So they probably appeal to slightly different voters. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your talk. And my husband and I are from Pennsylvania. I don't know if this belongs in the polls. It certainly belongs in our consideration of who we're voting for. But is character or criminal conviction or association with January 6th or intimidation to violence for your opponents or retribution for political opposites? I mean, is any of that addressed? And moral character or moral beauty? I just have to ask that.
It's confounding in some ways because we do ask questions about those things. And, a majority of the state's voters believe that what happened on January 6th was bad for democracy and should never happen again. When we ask about which candidates have an advantage on certain characteristics, Mr. Trump fares very badly on those kinds of character and truthfulness issues that you discuss. So all of that is true, but voters understand that, and there is still a segment of voters who say, I'm not wild about anybody. What am I supposed to do now? I think it's important. We ask about it frequently. I'm always surprised that more voters, it isn't factoring into their decision. But I think that what we always have to think about in our system is that candidates represent a bundle of things, right? If we had multiple parties and multiple candidates, you could pick on a couple of things that mattered most. In our system, you can't. You've got basically two choices, and you got to take the good with the bad. Now, maybe that bad is disqualifying. It certainly probably should be, but that's the truth, that we have to remember that our system doesn't allow for that kind of nuance in some instances because candidates represent a bundle of things. And so which thing in the bundle do you care about most? That's what voters are deciding on, I think.
Last question.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
If there was a horse race and one horse was named Momentum and the other one Distrust, which one would you be betting on? It seems that Kamala has a lot of momentum.
In the polling business, we call that a leading question.
Acknowledge.
Yes. Momentum certainly seems to have be having its moment. And I think what I'm most interested in, honestly, is does the momentum break as we've come to expect, or does it continue? I mean, why couldn't it could do one or the other? And we don't know yet. We don't have enough information. So anyway, is that it?
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next Saturday.